They called him a broken dog. They said she was a fragile child. Together, Max and Emily forged a bond no one could explain until the night a hospital declared her gone, and only the dog's bark proved otherwise. From betrayal by a family friend to a public showdown before the world, this story will hold your heart until the very last word. Like this video, subscribe, and join us as we follow a journey where love outshines science and loyalty rewrites destiny. The air still carried the aftertaste of rain, sharp and metallic, as if the whole town had been rinsed and left to drip. Willow Creek, Ohio never looked grand, just a scattering of weather-worn porches, tired maples, and the steady hum of a place that had stopped expecting surprises. But that evening, something stirred at the edge of the salvage yard where rows of abandoned cars leaned on one another like old soldiers who'd lost their wars. Emily Carter heard it first. Not the usual clatter of loose siding in the wind, nor the low hiss of a semi on the highway, but a cry thin, raw, threaded with panic. A dog. She stopped where the sidewalk ended, shoes sinking into wet grass, head tilted as if tuning a radio dial. She was 11, too young for the heavy silence that clung to her house since her mother's funeral, but old enough to feel the way grief rearranged a family into strangers under the same roof. She had learned to move carefully around her father's quiet, to fill the empty places with the kind of small bravery children invent when no one tells them how. The cry came again. Emily's chest tightened a pull she didn't resist. She crossed the ditch and knelt by the chain-link fence. Rust had eaten its corners, and rainwater pooled at the gate's sagging hinge. Beyond stretched a graveyard of machines. Hulls, stacked high windows, cracked puddles reflecting a bruised sky. The sound was inside. She dropped flat belly against gravel damp enough to stain her shirt and peered under the gap. "Em," her father called. His voice was the careful kind he used when he worried she might break. David Carter was 36, but carried himself like an older man. His shoulders bowed under grief and work he didn't talk about. His hands were still red from the plumbing job he'd abandoned in the kitchen. "Don't go in there. That place isn't safe." "He's hurt," Emily said simply. Her voice didn't wobble. She was already sliding under the fence. David followed because a father always does, though every instinct in him screamed to pull her back. The gravel bit into his palms as he crawled after her. Inside, the smell was heavy with rust and oil. Emily moved along a row of cars, listening. The sound grew louder near a cinder-block shed leaning into the corner of the yard. Its door hung half open. She pushed it wider, hinges complaining, and the dim light revealed chaos. A shelf toppled, bolts scattered like marbles. Beneath the bent metal eyes gleamed. The dog wasn't small, but he was starved thin. German shepherd in the set of his ears' ribs counting themselves beneath mud-streaked fur. A snarl of wire had trapped his hind leg against the shelf. The flesh around it was rubbed raw. His chest heaved once, twice, then he made that desperate apologetic sound again. "Easy," Emily whispered, lowering herself until her eyes met his. The words seemed to steady him. David crouched beside her, scanning the injury with a mechanic's mind. "I'll lift the shelf. You get the wire." Careful, he could bite. "He won't," Emily said with a certainty that startled even herself. She set her hand on the floor near the dog's paw, but didn't touch him yet. His eyes flicked from David to her, then stayed. David braced and pushed. The shelf moaned upward. Emily's small fingers worked the wire loose, every twist a sting of defiance against whatever cruelty had put it there. At last it snapped free. The dog didn't run. He stayed pressed against the concrete, watching her. When he tried to stand, the leg buckled. He dropped his head almost in shame. David exhaled relief, sharp as pain. "We'll carry him. I'll get his chest. You steady the leg." Emily slid her arms around the dog. His fur smelled of wet iron and old earth, but his body gave without resistance. He let them lift him, his gaze fixed not on the open door, not on escape, but on her face. They slipped back through the fence gap. The dog inched forward on his belly until his ears brushed her wrist. David raised the wire enough for him to wriggle through, and then they were out standing in the ditch grass with a creature who seemed stitched to them already. At home, the porch sagged under their weight. Emily guided the dog to the kitchen where yellow light softened the linoleum. David fetched a towel and cleaned the leg with the care of a man who had forgotten how to hope. The wound was ugly, but not deep. The dog endured every touch without protest, eyes locked on Emily as though she were translating the world into safety. "He needs a name," she said. The words came quiet like discovery. "Max. He looks like a Max." David studied the dog, too thin, too wary, but still holding himself with dignity. He nodded. "Max it is." Max ignored the chicken David offered, turning instead toward the girl. When she knelt, he pressed his head lightly to her thigh. That single gesture, deliberate, careful, tied something invisible between them. That night, David spread a blanket in the mudroom. Emily placed a frayed teddy bear beside it, but Max didn't settle until she walked him there. He waited at the threshold, eyes following her every step, only lying down when she did. Later, when David tried to close the door, Max rose and leaned his shoulder against it until Emily's sleepy voice carried down the hall. "Leave it open, Dad." So he did. Hours passed. The house creaked. The wind rattled a loose pane. David stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. Emily slept, one hand fallen outside her blanket. Max lay curled nearby, ears alert to sounds only he seemed to hear. When he lifted his head, he looked first at the girl, then let his chin rest again on the floor, as if guarding a treasure he had already chosen. By morning, the mudroom smelled of fur and damp cotton. Emily tiptoed in with socked feet, and Max rose smoothly, wagging once as if to say he had been waiting. David phoned Linda Parker from the rescue, leaving a message about a shepherd mix found injured at the yard. But already he knew whatever papers were filed, whatever rules applied, Max had made his choice. The first days after Max came home, life inside the Carter house shifted in small but unmistakable ways. David had expected the dog to roam restlessly, sniffing doors and windows, waiting for the first chance to disappear. Instead, Max planted himself at Emily's side as though he had been assigned a post. He shadowed her in the kitchen, waited outside the bathroom door, curled at her feet while she read. If she left the room, his head lifted at once, ears angling to catch her steps, and he rose to follow with steady, patient loyalty. Linda Parker at the rescue had scanned him for a microchip and checked his leg. "He's lucky," she'd said, wrapping a clean bandage. "The muscles bruised, but no fractures. He'll walk with a limp for a while. Keep him rested and he'll heal." She had filled out paperwork suggesting the shelter could take him in, but David hesitated. Emily's eyes never left the dog's, and Max never once turned from her. When David finally signed the form to foster, Emily exhaled as if she had been holding her breath since the salvage yard. That night, Max lay on a blanket in the mudroom, but only after Emily showed him where. The week passed with ordinary rhythms. Emily at school, David at his transcription work in the converted dining room, Max waiting faithfully until the bus brought her back. He ate sparingly accepted water from David's hand, but it was Emily he leaned toward, Emily, whose footsteps made his ears lift. On Friday evening, twilight pressed against the kitchen windows. Emily sat at the table with her math book, chewing her pencil, frustrated by fractions. David rinsed dishes at the sink, the radio low, a game playing in the background. Max lay at her side on the linoleum, chin on his paws, eyes appearing half asleep. What happened next drew a line between before and after. Emily rubbed her temple, frowning at the page. She reached for her glass of water, but her hand faltered. She hadn't yet felt the dizziness fully bloom, but Max was already on his feet. His ears sprang forward, and he nudged her knees sharply, whining in a tone David had never heard high-urgent, insistent. Emily blinked confused. The room tilted. Her pencil slipped and she began to slump sideways. David spun from the sink, but Max had braced himself against her chair, buying seconds. David caught her before she struck the floor. She lay, pale eyelids, fluttering breath, shallow but present. Max barked once, sharp and commanding, as if demanding David hurry. The sound echoed against the cabinet, startling in its authority. David carried her to the couch, his hands shaking, whispering her name until she stirred. Within moments, her eyes opened, dazed but aware. She whispered, "I'm okay," embarrassed by the attention. But Max didn't relax. He paced in front of the couch, circling once, then returned to her side, pressing his nose to her hand as if confirming she was still there. Later, when the house quieted again, Emily whispered to her father, "He knew before I did." David tried to reassure her, saying dogs often sense things humans miss. Smells, posture, changes in breathing. "Maybe you looked pale. Maybe you shifted," he said, though his voice carried doubt even he could hear. The next morning, Emily tested her suspicion. While tying her sneakers before school, she rose too quickly on purpose. Before the dizziness touched her, Max sprang forward, planting himself against her shin, whining softly. She steadied herself, shaken not by the moment, but by the precision of his timing. All weekend she observed him. On Saturday, as she read on the porch swing, Max sprawled nearby, eyes closed. When she began rubbing her temples against an ache, he was on his feet, instantly pawing her elbow until she leaned back to rest. On Sunday, carrying laundry with her father, she felt fatigue creep in. At the top of the stairs, Max blocked her path, refusing to move until she set the basket down and sat. Each time his response was immediate, exact, and consistent. When she tried to explain, David dismissed it again. "Dogs are smart," he repeated, folding towels. "He's just protective." But Emily felt certainty growing like roots. She needed proof. Monday after school, she carried the family's old camcorder upstairs. She propped it on her dresser, aimed it toward her bed, and left it running. Max curled at her feet. She lay still, closed her eyes, then rose suddenly. Before her balance shifted, Max leapt up, whining that same sharp note. The camera caught it all. She tried again in the yard the next day, pretending to stumble while the camera recorded from the porch railing. Once more, Max reacted first, steadying her before the act looked convincing even to herself. A third attempt in the living room confirmed the pattern. In each recording, Max moved seconds before Emily showed signs of distress. By Friday evening, she sat with David at the kitchen table, the camcorder on the surface between them. Her heart pounded as she pressed play. Together they watched the grainy footage, Emily motionless one moment, Max snapping to attention the next, her faintness following only afterward. David leaned closer, his jaw tightening as the evidence repeated itself. When the tape ended, the kitchen filled with the low hum of the refrigerator. Emily waited, eyes shining. "See? He knows." David rubbed his temple, struggling between reason and the pull of what he had witnessed. "It could still be coincidence," he said finally, but his voice was heavy, uncertain. Max sat at their feet, eyes moving between father and daughter, silent yet steady. His tail tapped once against the floor, a quiet rhythm, as though confirming what Emily had already decided. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, David replayed the footage alone. He watched Max rise again and again, alert before the faintest sign touched Emily. In the corner of the room, Max lay awake, his eyes fixed not on the flickering screen, but on the staircase, listening for the sound of Emily's breath above. David whispered almost to himself, "If you know before we do, don't stop." Max's ears twitched the only answer needed. The discovery that Max could sense Emily's faint spells before she even realized what was happening weighed heavily on David. He watched the recording several more times in the days that followed each time, unable to explain how the dog seemed to know. Reason told him that dogs could smell subtle changes in body chemistry, perhaps shifts in heart rate or perspiration, but the precision unsettled him. When Emily spoke with excitement about showing her teacher, David shook his head firmly and told her not to mention it at school. He explained that if word spread too far, people might come with questions he could not answer, and worse, some might want to take Max away for testing. Emily frowned but listened, sensing the protective edge in his voice. He remembered how the hospital staff had once dismissed Jennifer's symptoms before her cancer was caught too late, and he carried the fear of institutions like a scar. If strangers in white coats learned what Max could do, they might treat him not as a companion, but as a specimen. So David kept the truth contained inside their home, as though silence could shield them. Yet Max was not a secret that could be controlled. The dog's vigilance followed Emily everywhere, and though at home it seemed natural outside, it drew eyes. On a chilly Saturday morning, David took Emily to the farmers' market that gathered downtown each week. He hoped the outing would distract her from the endless routine of medication and schoolwork. Emily wore her red jacket and carried a canvas bag, while Max trotted close on a leash, his limp faint but improving. They wandered between stalls buying apples and honey, greeting neighbors who still whispered condolences for Jennifer. For a while the morning felt almost ordinary. Then, as Emily reached for a basket of peaches, Max stiffened. His ears shot up, his body tense. He whined sharply and pressed his flank against Emily's legs. She blinked confused, then felt a wave of dizziness rise inside her like a tide. David dropped the honey jar in his hand and caught her shoulders, guiding her to a bench. Max barked once, loud and commanding, the sound echoing between the stalls. Several shoppers turned. A vendor hurried over with a bottle of water. Emily's face was pale, but she managed a weak smile, insisting she was all right after a moment. Still, the attention lingered. People murmured about how the dog had reacted before the girl fell, how uncanny it seemed. David felt the weight of their eyes. He thanked the vendor, quickly led Emily away, and tugged gently on Max's leash. But Max would not be hurried. He paced at Emily's side, glancing up at her as though waiting for her to falter again. When they reached the truck, David lifted her inside, his heart pounding with fear, not only for her health, but for what others had witnessed. He drove home in silence, gripping the wheel too tightly. At dinner that evening, Emily recounted the story with pride. He knew again, Dad. Everyone saw it. Her voice carried the thrill of being believed. David cut his food slowly, avoiding her eyes. Yes, but that's not always good, he said. People will talk. Some will ask questions we can't answer. They might not see Max as we do. Emily's fork paused midway. But he saved me. Her voice trembled with confusion. David softened, nodding. He did, and he always will. But we need to be careful. Not everyone cares about what's best for you or him. The following week, caution proved impossible. Emily's school held a fall fair, a tradition with games and food stalls set up across the gymnasium and playground. David hesitated to bring Max, but Emily insisted, arguing that the dog calmed her and that she felt safer with him close. Reluctantly, he agreed, keeping the leash short as they walked through the decorated hallways. Children rushed past in excitement, balloons bumping against the ceiling. Teachers greeted them warmly, though some raised brows at the sight of the shepherd. At the ring toss game, Emily laughed as she missed her third throw. David allowed himself a smile, glad to see her joy. Then Max froze. His body snapped, rigid eyes locked on Emily, a low whine vibrating from his chest. David's heart clenched. Emily swayed, clutching the table for balance. Before anyone else noticed, Max lunged forward, pressing his shoulder into her legs to steady her. She collapsed into a crouch rather than falling, saved from striking her head on the concrete. This time the gym fell silent around them. Children gasped, parents whispered. A teacher hurried over asking if she needed the nurse. David knelt beside Emily, helping her breathe slowly. She recovered within minutes, embarrassed by the crowd, but the whispers rose. "Did you see the dog move before she even fell?" It's like he knew. Phones appeared recording. David's stomach sank. He guided Emily toward the exit, but the eyes followed, curious and unsettled. That night, while Emily slept, David sat in the kitchen with the lights low. Max lay by the door, head lifted, eyes reflecting the dim glow. David whispered, "They'll notice. They'll want to know why. And once they know, they'll come." The dog blinked slowly, as though unconcerned, then turned his gaze toward the hallway where Emily slept. David realized with a twist of unease that Max was beyond his control. The bond between girl and dog was stronger than secrecy. No warning could restrain what had already begun to unfold. After the school fair incident, whispers moved through Willow Creek faster than David had feared. Parents repeated what they had seen. Children described the dog's sudden movements with wide eyes, and before long even the local grocer asked questions David had no interest in answering. Emily, however, seemed proud. For the first time in years, she felt seen not only for her fragility, but for the partnership she shared with Max. She spoke of it with the certainty of a child who had found a protector no one could take away. It was only a matter of days before Officer Mark Miller stopped by. He was a man in his early 40s with the kind of easy authority that came from years on the town's streets. His cruiser pulled up one late afternoon as David raked leaves. Miller greeted him with respect, asked after Emily, and then, without much delay, mentioned that he had heard about the dog. David bristled, already defensive, but Miller raised a calming hand. He explained he had worked alongside K-9 units before, and that what people described about Max sounded extraordinary. "If it's true," he said carefully, "this isn't just loyalty. It's instinct sensitivity. That kind of awareness can save lives." David shook his head, wary. He spoke of privacy, of not wanting Emily treated like an exhibit. But Emily, who had stepped onto the porch at the sound of their voices, called down, "Max does know Officer Miller. He helps me." Her voice was steady, almost proud. Max stood beside her, ears up, posture alert. The officer studied the pair, then asked gently if David would consider allowing Max to be evaluated by the department's K-9 trainer. Not to take him away, Miller assured, but to understand what he can do and maybe strengthen it. "He can still live with you." Reluctance fought against reason inside David. He feared exposure, feared losing the fragile balance of their lives. Yet he also knew the burden he carried: Emily's health, the uncertainty of every faint spell, and he could not ignore the possibility that training might sharpen Max's abilities further. After long silence, he agreed to a trial evaluation under strict condition that Max would not be separated from Emily. 2 weeks later, on a crisp morning, they drove to the county training facility, a fenced field behind the sheriff's office where dogs learned obedience and scent detection. Sergeant Paul Harris, the K-9 trainer, greeted them. He was a man with weathered hands and a practical manner, more accustomed to commanding dogs than soothing children. He explained the test. Simply, Max would be asked to follow standard commands: sit, stay, heel, and then a few tasks with distraction. Emily stood with Max at her side, one hand lightly touching his collar. Harris began with confidence. He issued the command, "Sit." Max stood still, unblinking. "Stay," Harris said, stepping back. Max did not move, but neither did he obey. He simply ignored the man. Harris frowned, repeated louder. The dog's ears flicked, but his eyes remained on Emily as though the trainer were background noise. Harris tried again with sharper tone, then clapped his hands. Max tilted his head once, but did not respond. The trainer looked at David with a raised brow. "He's stubborn." Emily, unable to watch, in silence whispered, "Max, sit." At once the shepherd lowered his haunches to the ground with perfect form. Harris blinked, surprised. "Stay," Emily added. Max froze, posture flawless, not even his tail twitching. Harris stepped around him, tried to distract with noise, even tossed a ball. Max held still, eyes on the girl. Harris called out to Emily, "Release him." She spoke, "Okay, Max." Instantly he sprang up, tail wagging once before resettling at her feet. Harris rubbed his chin. "That's unusual. He ignores me completely but obeys her voice without hesitation." He tested further heel down, wait. Each time Max ignored the trainer, but when Emily repeated the words, Max executed them perfectly crisp as if born to the commands. By the end of the session, Harris admitted he had never seen such singular loyalty. "It's not disobedience," he explained. "It's focus. He has bonded so strongly with her that he filters everything else out. That can be a strength if managed carefully, but it also means he isn't a typical candidate for service in the way we expect." Emily listened with a small smile, stroking Max's neck. To her, it was not limitation, but proof of what she had felt from the first night. Max was hers, and she was his. David, though uneasy, felt something else stir an acknowledgement that this bond was not fragile but formidable, something even professionals recognized. Before they left, Harris suggested a program tailored not for standard policing but for medical alert partnership. With her involvement, he could learn to signal in ways others understand to work in public without confusion. "If you're willing, I'd like to train them as a team." David hesitated, the old fear returning. Yet, when he saw Emily's expression hopeful bright in a way he had not seen since her mother's passing, he knew the decision was already written. Driving home, Emily leaned against Max in the back seat, whispering promises to him. David glanced in the mirror. The dog's eyes were closed, but his body leaned protectively toward the girl. For the first time, David considered that perhaps secrecy was not enough to shield them. Perhaps guidance, the right kind, might prepare them for the attention that was already gathering. After Sergeant Harris's evaluation, the Carter family tried to settle into a rhythm again, though it was never quite the same. Emily now had exercises to do with Max each day, tasks designed to sharpen his alert signals and help others recognize them. David watched cautiously, still wary of too much attention, but he could not deny how Emily's confidence grew. For the first time in years, she walked into rooms without scanning for danger because Max was already doing it for her. She carried herself differently, shoulders no longer hunched in fear of the next fainting spell, as though she believed Max would catch her if she fell. The autumn chill deepened. On a Thursday evening, David drove Emily to the hospital for a scheduled neurology checkup. Her spells had become less frequent, but her doctor wanted updated scans. Emily sat in the waiting room, clutching Max's leash, her red jacket bunched at her elbows, eyes on the muted television. Max lay at her feet, but not asleep, his gaze darting often to her face. When the nurse finally called her name, Emily rose, David at her side, Max trotting close. The nurse raised a brow but allowed the dog after David explained the medical alert training. Inside the examination room, electrodes were attached to Emily's scalp for an EEG. The machine hummed softly, recording patterns of her brain activity. David sat in the corner, flipping through a worn magazine without seeing the pages. The neurologist, Dr. Anderson, monitored the screen, noting that Emily's condition seemed stable. Emily smiled, faintly relieved. For a few minutes, everything felt steady. Then Max stiffened. His ears shot forward, his body braced, and he let out a sharp whine. Emily blinked, confused. Dr. Anderson glanced at the monitors, which still showed no abnormal activity. David sat upright, alarmed by the dog's intensity. Max moved, suddenly pressing against Emily's legs, then rearing up to brace his chest against her side. The motion startled the nurse, but within seconds Emily gasped, her eyes rolling back as a seizure began. Her small frame convulsed, but instead of crashing sideways against the exam table, she landed across Max's waiting body. He lowered himself deliberately, cushioning her fall, his head pressed close to hers. The room erupted in movement. The nurse reached for oxygen. Dr. Anderson barked orders and David leapt forward. But it was Max who had prevented the injury that might have fractured her skull against the table's sharp edge. Emily shook violently, the seizure stronger than those before. David knelt helpless, whispering her name while Max held his position, muscles rigid, absorbing the impact of her spasms without flinching. When the seizure finally slowed Emily's breathing, shallow but steady, the medical team moved quickly to stabilize her. Dr. Anderson kept glancing from the monitors to the dog. "Remarkable," he murmured. The EEG had finally caught the abnormal spikes, but Max had reacted nearly a full minute earlier. David, shaken, clutched Emily's hand, his other hand instinctively stroking Max's back in gratitude. Later, as Emily slept in recovery, Dr. Anderson spoke quietly to David. "I've never seen an animal respond with such precision." He anticipated the seizure before our instruments recorded clear changes. His intervention prevented serious injury. David nodded, still pale, struggling with the weight of both fear and awe. He had fought to keep Max's abilities hidden, yet here was undeniable proof witnessed by trained professionals. When Emily woke, she reached for Max immediately. The shepherd lifted his head from the floor beside her bed, eyes steady, tail thumping once. She whispered, "You caught me," and pressed her cheek against his fur. David swallowed hard, realizing that no warning, no secrecy could erase the bond in front of him. It was no longer only Emily who believed. The following morning, Dr. Anderson requested a demonstration for a team of specialists. David hesitated, but Emily insisted. "They need to know," she said firmly. During the test, sensors monitored Emily again while the doctors observed from behind glass. For half an hour, nothing happened. Then Max abruptly rose, ears stiff. Seconds later, the EEG spiked, confirming a pre-seizure pattern. The doctors exchanged startled looks. "He's detecting it before our machines," one whispered. By the time Emily had finished, the team acknowledged Max as something beyond coincidence. Dr. Anderson told David, "This dog may change how we understand seizure prediction, but most importantly, he's saving your daughter." David listened, torn between gratitude and fear of where such attention might lead. That evening, driving home with Emily drowsy in the back seat and Max curled beside her, David gripped the wheel. The headlights cut through the autumn darkness, and he thought of how close he had come to losing her, how close she had come to cracking her skull against steel. He glanced in the mirror. Emily's small hand rested on Max's back, and Max, though weary, kept his eyes half open, ever watchful. David whispered to himself, "He really is her shield." The thought, once terrifying, now settled with a strange calm. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe Max was not just a protector, but a partner fate had delivered at the exact moment they needed him. And though he still feared the world outside, he also knew the truth could no longer be hidden. The events of the seizure at the hospital spread quietly among the staff, whispered with surprise in break rooms and corridors. Nurses described how the shepherd had moved before the monitor spiked, how he had absorbed the girl's fall without flinching. Some staff were intrigued, even inspired, but others grew uneasy. Hospitals lived by protocols, and animals did not fit easily into sterile rules. A week later, when Emily returned for extended observation, David was met not with admiration, but resistance. At the admissions desk, a woman in a pressed uniform frowned at Max's leash. "Animals are not permitted in clinical areas," she stated. David explained patiently that Max was a trained medical alert dog, that Dr. Anderson himself had witnessed his work, but the woman shook her head. "He is not certified. Without official designation, he is a risk." Dr. Anderson intervened at first, securing temporary permission by calling Max an essential medical support. But administrative voices rose higher. At a meeting with David, a hospital administrator named Dr. Barnes declared firmly, "We cannot allow liability. An animal in clinical settings poses infection risk and distraction. We will not jeopardize patient safety." David clenched his fists, but kept his tone steady. "That animal caught my daughter before she cracked her skull. He predicted her seizure before your machines did. How is that a danger?" Barnes adjusted his glasses coldly. Medicine is not guided by anecdote. Machines provide measurable data. If the dog remains, it is against regulation. Emily sat quietly beside Max during the meeting, her small hand resting on his back. She whispered afterward, "They don't see him, Dad. Not really." David wanted to argue to fight, but he also saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He agreed reluctantly to let Max stay only in the family waiting room while Emily underwent overnight monitoring. Emily tried to smile bravely, but when David guided Max out, she looked suddenly small beneath the hospital blankets. Max resisted, planting his paws on the linoleum, ears back, eyes locked on her. Only David's steady hand and whispered promise brought him to heel. That evening, David tried to rest in the stiff chair by Emily's bed. Machines beeped in rhythmic patterns. Wires stretched across her scalp and chest screens glowed green and steady. Nurses checked vitals every hour. Emily drifted between shallow sleep and brief wakefulness. Without Max, the room felt hollow, as though a shield had been stripped away. Near midnight, the ward quieted. Fluorescent lights dimmed to a softer hum. David dozed for moments at a time, his head nodding against his chest. Then Emily shifted, a low moan escaping her lips. The monitor above her bed flickered, then steadied. David stirred, unsure if it was dream or waking. He looked at the screen, no alarms, no changes. He touched Emily's hand, felt its clammy sweat. In the waiting room beyond the heavy door, Max lay restless. He had not curled to sleep as other dogs might. Instead, he paced, ears, pricked nose, twitching body tense. Suddenly, he let out a sharp bark, startling the night nurse at the desk. He pawed at the door, whined, then barked again, the sound carrying urgency like an alarm. The nurse frowned, rose to quiet him, but Max refused to settle. He leapt against the door claws, scraping, barking in rapid bursts. Inside Emily's room, the monitor froze the line flat for a second before sputtering back. David leapt to his feet, shouting for help. Emily's body stiffened, her chest heaving. Alarms blared a second later, too late to be warning. Nurses rushed in, calling codes, adjusting oxygen, checking IV lines. One nurse exclaimed that the monitor's sensor had failed minutes earlier, showing false steadiness until it glitched. David realized in horror that Max had sensed it before the machines failed, that his frantic bark had coincided with Emily's silent struggle. The doors burst open, and Max lunged inside before anyone could stop him. He bounded past the staff and pressed against the bed, whining, nose nudging Emily's arm. David shouted, "Let him stay!" His voice cracked with desperation. The medical team focused on stabilizing Emily, but no one dared drag the dog away. As medications coursed through the IV, Emily's spasms eased, her breathing steadied, the alarms softened. Only then did Max lower himself, chest pressed to the floor, his eyes never leaving her face. Later, when calm returned, Dr. Barnes entered visibly unsettled. He surveyed the scene, then the restless dog curled by the bed. "This cannot continue," he muttered, but his authority felt thinner. Dr. Anderson countered quietly, "Machines failed tonight." He did not. "You cannot deny what we witnessed." Barnes said nothing further, retreating with his clipboard. David sat beside Emily, stroking her damp hair, then reached down to touch Max's head. "You saved her again," he whispered. The dog blinked slowly, leaning into the touch, as if to remind him this was not chance, but purpose. By morning, word of the night's events had spread among the staff. Some still muttered about rules and risks, but others regarded Max with quiet respect. A nurse slipped David a cup of coffee and said softly, "If that had been my child, I'd want him here too." Emily, pale but recovering, reached for Max's paw with a faint smile. The dog placed it carefully in her hand, and she sighed as if finally able to rest. The night Max saved Emily, despite the machine failure, should have been a private triumph, a moment carried quietly by those who witnessed it. Instead, whispers spilled into the town, then onto screens. By the following week, a local news station ran a story titled, "Father Claims Dog Predicts Daughter's Seizures." The piece showed a shaky clip filmed by a nurse during the commotion, Max barking and lunging at the hospital door, followed by Emily convulsing as staff rushed in. The commentary did not celebrate the dog. Instead, the anchor's tone suggested spectacle. Questions remain about whether the Carter family exaggerated events, the reporter said. Some accused David Carter of exploiting his daughter's illness to draw attention. David sat frozen in the living room as the broadcast ended, the television casting cold light across his face. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug, arms wrapped around Max's neck. She whispered, "They make it sound ugly, Dad." He switched off the screen, his jaw tight. People believe what they want when they don't understand. But the story spread. Neighbors asked pointed questions. At the grocery store, someone muttered that David wanted donations, though none had been requested. Online comments multiplied, some praising Max, others calling the Carters liars. The weight of public doubt pressed hard. David avoided town gatherings. Emily noticed the way he hunched his shoulders as if expecting accusation at every corner. Then Officer Miller arrived at their porch one crisp morning. He explained that the police chief and Sergeant Harris had arranged a demonstration to address the speculation. "If people see for themselves, the noise will quiet," Miller said. David hesitated, his protective instincts flaring. But Emily gripped his hand. They should know Max is real. They should see. Her determination was steady, stronger than her years. Reluctantly, David agreed. The event was set for a Saturday at the county fairgrounds. Folding chairs lined the field, cameras clustered near the front. Reporters scribbled notes while townspeople filled the rows. Their expressions a mixture of doubt and curiosity. David kept Emily close, his hand firm on her shoulder. Max sat at her side, posture alert but calm, as if he sensed the scrutiny. Sergeant Harris stepped to the microphone. He introduced the demonstration, explaining Max's background as a rescue and his emerging role as a medical alert companion. Then he described this test. A controlled simulation would be conducted. Emily would wear monitoring equipment while engaging in mild activity, and observers would note Max's reactions. Harris's voice was measured professional, though even he seemed unsure how the dog would perform under so many eyes. The demonstration began. Emily walked slowly across the grass, her small figure dwarfed by the crowd. Max trotted beside her ears, sharp eyes scanning her face. For several minutes nothing happened. Murmurs rose, skeptics shifting in their seats. A reporter whispered loudly, "Maybe the father coached them." David clenched his fists, his stomach a knot. Then Max stiffened. His body froze mid-step, ears forward, tail rigid. He whined sharply and nudged Emily's leg. She stopped, puzzled. The monitoring device clipped to her wrist flickered, showing a rise in irregular activity. The observers leaned forward. A second later, Emily swayed her knees, buckling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But Max lunged under her, pressing his body against her legs, guiding her gently to the grass instead of letting her collapse hard. His bark rang out once, sharp, unmistakable. Medics rushed forward, but Emily lifted her hand weakly. "I'm okay," she whispered, as Max licked her fingers, eyes locked on her face. The monitors confirmed seizure activity had spiked exactly as Max predicted. The demonstration had unfolded without rehearsal, undeniable in its timing. The crowd, once murmuring with suspicion, erupted in applause. Cameras clicked furiously. Parents whispered about wishing they had such a protector for their own children. Sergeant Harris raised a hand for quiet, then spoke firmly. "You have witnessed what many doubted. This is no trick, no exaggeration. Max's loyalty and perception have kept Emily safe when medicine alone could not. That is the truth." Reporters crowded forward, no longer accusing, but eager, asking about training methods and future plans. David answered carefully, his voice steady, though his heart still raced. "Max is not for show," he said. "He is Emily's guardian. That is all that matters." After the demonstration, as the crowd dispersed, strangers approached with kindness rather than suspicion. A mother with a child in a wheelchair whispered, "Your story gives us hope." Emily smiled shyly, clutching Max's fur. David felt a strange relief settle over him, as though a heavy door had finally opened. That evening at home, Emily sat on the porch with Max stroking his coat. "They believe now," she whispered. David stood in the doorway, watching her silhouette against the setting sun. For the first time in weeks, the weight of doubt seemed lighter. Yet deep inside, he knew attention had only begun. What had once been their private shield was now a story the world wanted to claim. The weeks after the public demonstration brought a tide of attention that neither David nor Emily had expected. Strangers mailed letters, some filled with gratitude, others with pleas for help. Parents of sick children asked if Max could come to hospitals, schools, even homes. Officials called to discuss possibilities. At first, David declined every request, protecting the fragile balance of their lives. But the pressure did not fade. Even friends began to question whether Max's gift should remain confined to a single child. Tom Reed had been David's closest friend since high school. He had stood at David's side during Jennifer's funeral, helped repair the Carter roof after a storm, and sat at countless backyard dinners. To Emily, he was Uncle Tom, a steady presence she trusted. Yet as news of Max spread, Tom's visits shifted. He spoke often about service, about duty to the greater good. One evening, as the two men sat on the porch after Emily had gone to bed, Tom leaned forward. "Dave, you know I love Emily. But think about what Max could do if he worked with a full K-9 unit. He could save dozens of lives, maybe hundreds. Isn't that worth more than just one child?" David's jaw tightened. He answered with quiet steel. "She's not just one child. She's my daughter, and Max is hers." Tom pressed, arguing that David was being selfish, that the world needed Max. David stood, ending the conversation. But the unease lingered. Days later, David returned home from errands to find the yard silent. Emily sat on the porch steps, her face pale with fear. "Max is gone," she whispered. David's heart slammed. They searched the house, the yard, the nearby streets. Neighbors had seen a truck parked briefly at the curb. A witness mentioned Tom's familiar figure leading the dog away. David's chest ached with betrayal. He called Tom's phone, but there was no answer. Meanwhile, Max sat confined in the back of Tom's pickup as it rumbled toward the county facility. Tom spoke over his shoulder, trying to soothe his own guilt. "You'll do good work, boy. You'll help more people this way." But Max's ears pinned back, his body tense. He did not whine or bark. He waited. At the facility, Tom explained to Sergeant Harris that he was delivering Max for official training. Harris frowned uneasy. "This isn't how it works, Tom. The family has to consent." Tom insisted, saying David would come around. But when Harris approached the truck, Max growled low, his eyes burning with refusal. The sergeant stepped back, unwilling to force him. Tom sighed, promising to return later with paperwork. That night, Tom locked Max in his garage, planning to call again in the morning. But Max was not passive. Hours after darkness fell, he worked at the latch, pressing until the door cracked. By dawn, the neighbors saw Shepard limping but determined, bounding across yards, nose to the wind. He ran until the familiar scent of home filled his lungs. At the Carter house, Emily sat awake at the window, her cheeks wet with tears. She had not slept since Max vanished. When the shape of a dog appeared at the end of the street, she gasped. "Dad, it's him," she cried, bursting onto the lawn in her pajamas. Max barreled into her arms, pressing his body against her tail, wagging furiously. Emily clung to him, sobbing into his fur. David stepped outside, relief flooding his face. He knelt, resting both hands on Max's back. "You found your way home," he whispered, his voice breaking. Later that morning, Tom arrived, shame flickering in his eyes. David met him at the driveway. "You had no right." David said quietly but firmly. Tom tried to argue to speak of service and duty again, but his words rang hollow against the sight of Emily curled against Max on the porch, her hand tangled in his fur. Tom's shoulders sagged. He muttered an apology and left. The friendship was fractured, perhaps beyond repair. Inside, Emily looked up at her father with fierce determination. "He chose us," she said. David nodded, knowing her words were truer than any explanation he could offer. Max had faced confinement, persuasion, and distance, yet nothing could sever his bond. His loyalty was not theory or argument, it was action proven on the road back to them. That night the house felt whole again. Emily slept with one hand resting on Max's back. David stood in the doorway, watching the slow rise and fall of their breathing. For the first time he felt not only fear of the world outside, but also strength in the bond that anchored them. The betrayal had hurt, but the return had carved something deeper, an unshakable trust that no one could take away. The weeks after Tom's betrayal had left David more protective than ever, but even his vigilance could not shield Emily from the unpredictable storm of her illness. One winter evening, Emily collapsed in the living room, her seizure more violent than any before. David rushed her to the hospital with Max in the back seat, the dog pressed so close that Emily's head rested against his shoulder. Snow fell in heavy flakes, the wipers fighting to clear a path. But David drove on, whispering prayers into the cold air. At the hospital, Emily was admitted straight into intensive care. Machines were attached quickly, lines running across her small frame monitors flashing erratic signals. Doctors spoke in clipped tones, their words circling around status epilepticus, a phrase David had come to fear. Max remained at the foot of the bed, watching, whining softly, eyes locked on Emily's face. Nurses looked uneasy, but Dr. Anderson overrode protocol. "He stays," he said firmly. "We've seen what he can do." Hours passed. The seizures did not stop, only slowed, then surged again. Emily's body weakened under the strain. By dawn, her vital signs dropped into dangerous territory. The monitor's beeping slowed until the tone stretched into an ominous flat line. A young resident whispered, "No pulse." Dr. Barnes entered, his expression clinical. He looked at the screen, then at David. "I'm sorry. We've done all we can. It's time to let her go." His words cut like a blade. David's knees buckled. He gripped the side of the bed, unable to speak. But Max exploded into motion. He leapt against the bed, barking furiously, a sound that shattered the sterile silence. His paws scraped the railing. His teeth bared not in aggression, but in desperate insistence. He lunged toward Emily, positioning himself so his chest pressed against her side, his head hovering near her mouth. Bark after bark filled the room, sharp and relentless. "Get that animal out!" Barnes snapped, but Max would not budge. He howled a sound so raw it shook the nurses. One nurse, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes, hesitated. She had seen Max predict seizures, had watched him save Emily before. Ignoring Barnes's command, she stepped forward with her stethoscope. She pressed it against Emily's chest, closed her eyes, and listened. A long pause filled the room. Then her head jerked up. "Wait, I hear something. It's faint, but it's there. Slow, irregular, but not gone." She repeated louder. "She's not gone." Barnes frowned, stepping toward the monitors. "The equipment shows nothing." He argued. The nurse shook her head fiercely. "Machines can fail. I'm telling you, she has a pulse." She gestured to Max, and he knew before I did. The room froze. Nurses scrambled back to work, adjusting medications, calling for advanced support. The flat line on the screen flickered, then rose into faint but undeniable peaks. Emily's heart beat weakly, hidden from the machines, but never from the dog who refused to surrender. David dropped into the chair, tears streaming silently down his face. He reached for Emily's hand and pressed it against his cheek. His voice shook. "She's still here." "I knew it. You knew it," he whispered to Max, who had quieted but remained glued to the bed, his body trembling with fierce devotion. As the medical team stabilized, Emily's whispers filled the room not of doubt, but of awe. One nurse muttered, "That dog may have just saved her life again." Dr. Anderson looked at David, his expression soft with something close to reverence. "Machines have limits," he said quietly. "But what he senses, it defies what we understand." Through the night, Emily's condition remained fragile, her breaths shallow, her pulse faint but steady. David never left her side. Max refused food, refused water, choosing only to rest his head on the edge of the mattress, his eyes never leaving her. When dawn light filtered through the blinds, Emily stirred faintly, her lips parting to form a whisper. David leaned close, but the sound was barely audible. Max's ears flicked and he pressed his nose gently against her hand. Her fingers twitched, curling faintly into his fur. Relief swept the room. Nurses exchanged smiles of cautious hope. David pressed his forehead against her small hand, whispering, "Hold on, sweetheart. We're here, both of us." Max exhaled a deep sigh that sounded almost human, as if sharing the weight of the night. When Dr. Barnes returned, his face unreadable, David stood straighter. His voice no longer trembled. "You were ready to declare her gone, but she wasn't." He knew it. He gestured to Max. Barnes opened his mouth, then closed it. No explanation could erase the truth. The silence spoke louder than excuses. For the Carter family, the night marked a turning point. They had lived in fear of losing Emily, but they had also seen proof that her life could not be measured by screens alone. Max had shown them and the hospital staff that loyalty and instinct could pierce through where technology faltered. Emily's fight was far from over, but the bond that tethered her to life had never been clearer. Winter passed into spring, and though Emily remained fragile, her recovery grew steadier with each week. The night when Max refused to accept the flatline had altered everything, not only for David, but for the entire hospital. The staff spoke of it in hushed tones, some as a miracle, others as a lesson in humility. What no one could deny was that Max had saved Emily's life once more, and this time his actions had forced even the most skeptical to admit that instinct could outpace technology. Soon after, representatives from the State Health Board arrived. David braced himself for the worst, expecting them to demand Max be surrendered for study. But the meeting unfolded differently. Instead of threats, the board presented recognition. Max would not be taken from Emily. Instead, he would be certified both as a medical companion and an honorary liaison for the K-9 division. Officer Miller, standing proudly in his uniform, handed Emily a small badge engraved with Max's name. The crowd gathered in the hospital auditorium applauded as Emily fastened it onto Max's collar, her smile bright, though her hand trembled. Reporters captured the moment, and for once the headlines carried no suspicion. Rescue dog officially recognized for life-saving roles spread across newspapers and broadcasts. Max was no longer a subject of doubt, but a symbol of loyalty and resilience. Emily, sitting in her wheelchair with Max by her side, answered questions in her soft but steady voice. "He's not just a dog," she said. "He's my best friend. He saved me when nothing else could." David watched from the edge of the stage, his chest heavy with emotion. Months of fear, secrecy, and suspicion had given way to acknowledgement. What once felt like a burden too heavy to bear had become a torch they carried together. Still, he knew recognition alone was not enough. Max's story could not end with Emily. There were other children, other families facing the same fear, waiting in hospital corridors with no warning before seizures struck. That thought became the seed of an idea. In the evenings, while Emily rested, David drafted notes, sketches of a vision. He spoke with Sarah Williams, director of the local animal shelter, about the possibility of training rescue dogs, not for patrol or guarding, but for companionship and medical alert. He called Dr. Anderson, who encouraged him to pursue it. Slowly, the plan became a proposal, then a foundation. They called it the Emily Carter Trust, though Emily insisted on including Max. Finally, they agreed on the name, the Max and Emily Foundation, dedicated to pairing rescued dogs with children who needed medical companions. The announcement came during a small ceremony at the town hall. David stood at the podium, Emily beside him, Max lying calmly at her feet. When my daughter was at her weakest, this dog gave her a second chance. David said, his voice steady but full of feeling. I cannot imagine how many other children are waiting for the same chance. That is why we are starting this foundation to train dogs like Max to be guardians, to give hope where fear has stolen it. Applause filled the room, not the polite applause of duty, but the genuine sound of people moved by truth. Volunteers signed up that very day. Local businesses pledged donations. Letters poured in from across the state, then across the country. Families asked to be part of the program, and animal shelters offered dogs in need of purpose. Over the months that followed, the Carter home became a hub of new beginnings. Trainers worked with dogs in the backyard, Emily cheering them on from her chair. Max, though still Emily's guardian, first served as the model for the program, demonstrating his signals and behavior. Reporters returned to capture the progress, this time telling the story not as scandal, but as inspiration. David, once reluctant to share their lives, found peace in knowing each retelling might plant a spark of hope elsewhere. One evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, David sat on the porch watching Emily and Max together. Emily had regained more strength. She now walked short distances with Max steady at her side. She laughed as Max nudged her hand for another treat. The sound carried across the yard like a song. David leaned back in his chair, exhaustion mingling with gratitude. For the first time in years, he no longer feared tomorrow. Instead, he looked forward, knowing they had built something that would outlive fear. That summer, the first class of trained medical companion dogs graduated under the Foundation's program. Children from across the region came with their families, each child meeting the dog that would walk beside them. Emily, wearing a simple blue dress, handed out ribbons, while Max wore his honorary canine vest tail wagging. Parents wept as they watched their children bond with the animals, relief and hope shining in their faces. In that moment, David understood the full circle of their journey. Max had come to them as a broken rescue saved by Emily's kindness. Now he had returned that gift by saving her life, and together they were giving that same chance to others. The bond between a child and a dog had become more than survival. It had become legacy. As the ceremony ended, Emily leaned against Max, her voice soft but sure. We did it, Dad. He's not just mine anymore. He's for everyone. David kissed the top of her head, his eyes on the horizon. Yes, sweetheart. And it all began with you and him believing in each other. Thank you for staying with us through this story. What part struck you the most? Was it the moment Max proved the doctors wrong, or when he found his way home? No matter what, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.